Hello, good afternoon. My name is Alice Roche and I'm the Head of Customer Service at Charity Digital. It's quite strange talking to people that aren't talking back. This is my first time hosting a webinar as I'm only 5 months into the role here at Charity Digital. So essentially what my team do is they help support the charities get registered with us so that they can access the discounted software and tech. So we check their eligibility and help basically support them be more digital. So yes, I'm only 5 months into the role and this is my first webinar and I'm really excited to host and find out all your questions. So today, like the title says, we are going to look at how charities can present a more engaging webinar. We're going to have tips on timing, length, slides, imagery, promotion, and much more. Before I hand over to our presenter, Nick Wyatt, I do need to go over some house rules. So the session will be recorded and slides will be sent out at some point. We will also upload a copy to YouTube soon, so keep an eye out for that. There is also a Q&A at the end, so get all your questions in and make sure to upvote your faves so that they have the best chance of being answered. We also have captions available for anyone that needs them. So now, without further ado, I will hand over to our fantastic presenter, Nick Wyatt, my colleague, who is going to hopefully deliver an engaging webinar, because that would be very ironic if it wasn't. Nick, are you ready for us?
Yeah. So found the introduction very enjoyable. Hello, everybody, and good day, and I hope you are all doing well. It's a very sunny day where I am, which is actually causing me an initial problem where I'm being a bit washed out by my screen a bit. So that's one thing probably not to do in a webinar, is get better lighting than I have right now. But yes, welcome. And yes, as Alice suggested, today is about how to present a engaging webinar, which I hope I do my best to keep it engaging. But as I will go through today's webinar, is that an engaging webinar means different things to different people and different organizations. So I cut myself a little bit of slack there. But yes, as Alice said, yes, so just a little introduction to myself. My name's Nick. I've been working here at Charity Digital as the Growth Marketing Executive for nearly 2 years now, just over 1.5 years, and that's how long I've been in the charity sector as well. I have presented, I think this is my 6th webinar I presented, and I've also hosted about 5 or 6 as well. So I've kind of learned how to do a little bit about both those sides of it. But what I've also been done here at Charity Digital is I've been given the opportunity to watch probably around 100 webinars. And in that time, I've been able to kind of learn a lot about what makes a really great webinar engaging and what makes one not so engaging. I've seen some webinars which are really engaging for all the wrong reasons, and some webinars that weren't that engaging, which were just totally brilliant, but didn't really get the results they needed. So it's in that time I've kind of learned like a lot about what are the key components that make them tick and what make them so engaging. And like I said before, it does depend on what you're trying to achieve, and it does depend on the organization. But I'm going to try and do a bit of an overview of all the things that kind of apply to everybody, and also try and break down how it might differ from one charity and organization to another. Right, so let's start from the top really here about why even host a webinar. Sometimes I think you can look at the idea of a webinar and it might be quite challenging or difficult. You might not really see a return on investment or for what you want to do or want to achieve. But essentially what a webinar gives you is an amazing way to connect with your audience of users. And I mean, that's kind of self-explanatory in a little bit, but as I always kind of tell people with these kind of things is it's lots of people are visual learners and audio learners, and webinars are the most amazing way to connect with people like that. I know that me personally, I prefer this kind of medium than anything else. I watch webinars all the time. I watch videos on YouTube of webinars. It's the best way that I feel the way to learn. But they also give you such an amazing platform to teach people skills or portray information or just generally engage with people. Like I said, once again, it varies from charity and organization to organization, but it's just an amazing way to basically open up you to those people. And as I put here, as a little bit of a stat, that study done by Wurzel, 83% of the people they interviewed on it found that webinars are really effective, and they're becoming more and more popular. Every day it seems that everyone's got their own webinar going on. It's kind of like the boom of podcasts has also kind of followed with the boom of webinars as well. So I really think they're a great resource that you should definitely try out if you're not already, and sort of see if it can work for your organization. Now, before really putting together a webinar, there's some key things that you need to do. Really, first of all, you need to work out what you're going to do. You need to think about your audience, and you need to think about what you want to do. And from there, we can put together a topic to work on a webinar for. So when you're thinking of the topic of the webinar, you kind of have to marry three things together. And essentially, first of all, I think it's finding the balance between what you would like to do, the value that you would like to give out versus the value your audience or users have or would like, for example. And also you want to make sure that it matches what your charity mission is. And the reason I say that is I've seen quite a lot of webinars where it's clear out the gate that the people holding the webinar want to achieve something and the audience want to get something else out of it. And then there's sort of a clash of interests, and then people don't really enjoy the webinar. So you've really got to make sure that what you want to put out there is something that your audience will value and will work with them. And then third thing you need to really marry this with is the idea that it has to be relevant and it has to be up to date. I know a friend of mine once told me he works for a tech charity in Reading, that his users really wanted, because of the specific demographic, they were trying to learn how to use Windows XP, even though it's a dead platform that shouldn't be used. And even though they knew how to teach it, they were like, well, we can't really teach you this. This isn't what you should be learning to use at the moment. I thought it was quite amusing, but yeah, that kind of gives you an example of like staying relevant, staying up to date, even if sometimes it kind of clashes with what you want to do or what your audience would like to do. It really needs to be relevant. And you don't want to hold a really in-depth webinar about something that's going to be out of date a week later. One thing I missed over there also is the idea that you should also play in your strengths and what you know when creating the topic, because you don't want to try and sort of research into something that you've never done or don't have much knowledge on, because you could really be putting out information that's not really accurate. Now, once you've chosen that topic and you found whatever's useful to you and your users and is up to date, really also ask yourself if it's right for a webinar. I know that's kind of discrediting what I just said about go for webinars, they're really great. But sometimes you might find that the topic you've come out for is quite a lengthy information-based thing, and it might be better as an article. It might be quite personal. You might feel it's better as a blog. It might be more discussion-based, so it might be better working as a podcast. So really think if it's worth as a webinar. If it's not, move to one of those mediums, but if it is, then that's perfect. And once you've kind of considered all this, and the last thing that's really important you need to think about is that you need to remember that you're going to be asking a lot of your audience and users here. You're essentially asking them to give up an hour of their time and an hour out of their lives, really. So make sure once you know what you're going to do, that you know that you can do it well as well, because you don't want to sort of put something out that's not that great, upset your users or your audience, and then it kind of leave a bit of a bad taste in your mouth after it's all said and done. So really make sure that you can do it as well once you've worked it all out. Now, before we've even created the webinar, we need to really start thinking also about the speaker, when you're going to do it, and what platform you're going to do it, because another key things here, there's lots of things to discuss with all of these issues. Now, starting with the really who, what, and where of webinars is that, and a really big point I need to make about this, and it's something I've learned while watching so many webinars, is sometimes the most knowledgeable people don't make the best speakers. What I mean by this is I actually watched a webinar, I think it was about 6 months ago, and the speaker was talking about his charity's mission and what they'd done. And it was fantastic. The things he was saying were amazing, but he was very monotone and very relaxing in a way that it was actually kind of hard to engage with. I found it fascinating because I was quite engaged with the topic, but we did watch as the numbers kind of decreased as it went on, because it just wasn't getting to people. It was a lot of information all at once. And even though what he was saying was great and there was so much knowledge there, it just wasn't engaging with people. So sometimes you might want to take a step back and think to yourself, would somebody else in my organization be better at presenting this? And if I just give them the knowledge that they need to do it, and I can help with that, because there's sometimes I've seen people who are, I've seen webinars presented by people who are quite new to the organization, but had that energy and they brought something to the table. So they were speaking from someone else's perspective, but it was very engaging because they brought that to the table. So really think about that as you're choosing a speaker, if you can do that. If you can't, then you really want to look at some of the key things to make yourself as engaging as possible. The first thing I always think is really important is try to ditch any long scripts. Webinars should be a bit more discussional and really ad lib about what you're doing. So sometimes having just a really long list that you're just reading off a screen, it's not very engaging. So if you try to move away from that, it might be quite tricky. It's definitely works out better in the long run. Also, make sure that you practice the webinar. I mean, that sounds a bit self-explanatory, of course you're going to do that, but sometimes I've seen a few where practice makes perfect. And if you're really nervous before presenting, just going over it and over it will really make it easier, because you know what you're doing. And then when the lights and cameras are on, you're prepared and you know exactly what to do. And also and I hope I'm trying to do this as best as possible, but try and bring the energy. One of the key things to making sure that your webinar is engaging is bringing that energy and really connecting with people that you're talking to so that it is as engaging as possible. But yeah, next thing you want to think about is the time that you're going to run your webinar. Now, for some organizations, that's probably going to be pretty set in stone because you might find that your users or your audience are only around a very specific time. It might be that you know that they're only available at 8 a.m. on a Friday or 8 p.m. on a Monday. Very weird times, but fair enough. You might know already. But if you don't really know where to start, a really good starting point is try and look at Tuesday to Thursday between 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Thursday is generally sort of known as the best day to go for. It's the day we use. We've always found great success with that day. But, try and marry that idea with what you think your audience is going to be most available for. It might be a little bit of trial and error to try and find that as well. And you might want to just ask your audience or users directly when they'd be available for it. But that's a really great place to start. Right. So I think when you run a webinar like this, you're hoping there's going to be a huge discussion where I'm going to come out and tell you what's the best platform, what's not the best platform, what's rubbish, what's great. But unfortunately, there is no real answer to that question. There's only really it depends. It depends what's best for you. Now, what I mean by that is that I always think that simplicity and comfortability and practicality wins out over the flashy tech all the time. I would rather use a platform I know how to use and I know can do a good job than something really great, extra bells and whistles. So what I really recommend you do, especially if you're starting out, is using the platform that's probably most comfortable for you and the one that you've got the most experience with, and also making sure that your audience can reach you there. Because we're doing this on Zoom at the moment. I'm very comfortable with Zoom. I've used it many, many times. Personally, it's my favorite to use for webinars. I've used Teams for webinars. I didn't love it because I found it slowed down my computer, but if you're really comfortable with it and you don't have that issue, it might be the platform for you. I used Google Hangouts all the time at university, and I found it to be a bit flashier than the other two, and I found it was quite cool. I just found it interesting, but I was a little bit nervous while using it because I wasn't 100% sure how it all worked. So once again, really just use what's best for you and where you think your audience is going to be. I've got a few other examples here like Webinar, Ninja, ClickMeeting, Demio, GoToWebinar, and Livestorm. All of them offer something slightly different. So if you're kind of looking for a new platform, have a look at them because they're all really interesting and they offer something, like I said, something a little bit different, and you might be able to bring something better with what you want to achieve to the table with them. So this is one thing I find so amusing when I watch webinars and it's quite sad, to be honest, is how many webinars derailed by tech. And it's something that people seem to forget about. They make amazing presentations, they get all the audience in, and then something breaks, or their microphone's rubbish, or the camera's rubbish. So this is why I really think it's important to get good headset, get a good microphone, get a good mic, get a good camera, and on top of that, make sure it's working perfectly before everything goes. I know that I've been using my own microphone, which is like one that goes directly into my headphone for many years now. I really like it. I use it for lots of different things, and I find it to be great for this and my headset also. We actually have a really great article on our website at the moment, which is essentially a more fleshed out version of this, really. And we've got some examples of great headsets and microphones that you can buy to really nail a webinar. And this is an extra point I think is really important. Well, important to me at least, is that if you are going to use your camera during a webinar, you usually have an option, especially on most modern computers or most modern webcams, is that you can run it in HD. And I think most people I see don't turn this feature on, and then they might have in standard definition. It's a bit pixelated, and sometimes it's hard to engage with a person that you can barely see. So if you are going to do this, go into your settings, have a look. I know on Zoom, it's sort of, you just go into your camera settings and it says HD, and it's just a better picture quality. And you might find that's a better way to engage with people if they can properly see you. Also, one thing is that you want to use any tech at your disposal to help make your webinars accessible as possible. So if you have live captions available or subtitles when it come out, make sure you use that so you don't narrow your audience down for the people who need those things. Right, so now we can actually start creating the webinar and we can make it as good as possible. So the key things to look at this is that it's like a good water park. You want your slides to be great. Before you start making them though, you need to really think about where you're going to make them. So there's key players like PowerPoint, Canva, Google Slides, Prezi, and DocSend, and so on. But very much like the platforms to present in, you really want to think about the ones which are you're most comfortable with and you are most practical for what you want to do. I mean, I think probably everyone will give PowerPoint a bit of a bad name because it's like old school a little bit. I didn't love it when I was younger, but I made most of this on PowerPoint with a little bit of help of Canva. And I find it to be a great platform for doing it. Now that I've gotten used to it, I feel like you can do most things that you want in it. But if you feel you want something else or you're more comfortable in another platform like Canva or Google Slides, really try and use those ones too. Sometimes the flashy stuff is not the great stuff, especially what type of webinar you're trying to run. So once again, find the one that works for you, most comfortable with, and use that. Now, one of the key things when making the actual webinar itself, and I see this problem a lot, is to try and avoid the reliance on written word. I always have the mindset of in a webinar that I put things down and they're almost a prompt for me to start talking about it in more detail, as I basically am right now about this point. But I have seen many, many webinars where people put lots of information, lots of word, and I feel that's a bit weird because I feel like you're almost then telling people to come to a webinar that's live and just read off a page, and that you are reading off a page as well, which unless you have a lot of key information that you really need to get across, and it depends on what you're doing, I would just try and stay away from it. And a good way to try and stay away from that is to use the 5-5 rule, which is essentially 5 bullet points per slide. Now, I'm pretty sure I've broken this rule on one of my previous slides because there was something extra I need to get in. But, you know, you could change it up a little bit. I don't think it matters too much, but it's a great place to start. When you're creating slides as well, and this, once again, I've seen this many, many times, is to try and keep everything clean and readable and relevant. I've seen, as I mentioned right at the beginning, I was actually watched one webinar and it was about fundraising. And it was so flashy and so engaging for all the wrong reasons. It had like great videos, animations happen. But then I came out of it being like, wow, that was a cool video. That was a great animation. But I was like, no idea what the webinar was about. And it was just not clean and it wasn't readable because everything else was kind of coming up at me. And I was like, woo. But you really don't want to distract your audience with the wrong thing. You want to get your message, those skills you're teaching, or whatever the purpose of your webinar is, across as best as possible. So we'll talk about those sort of things in a second, but making it more engaging with those techniques. But make sure that if you do use them, that you're using them right and correctly to not distract your audience from what's important. And like I said, just make it really clean and so it's concise and easy to read as well. There's one reason you should also avoid the sort of too much wording is because you never know really what device your audience is going to be watching on. And if they're watching on a mobile and you've got 200 words on a page, they're not going to be able to read that. So keeping it concise and clean is really important. Now, let's talk about the element of making it engaging. So I kind of just, talked bad about making it too engaging, but we'll get into that now about how you can make it as good as possible with the tools at your disposals. So the key thing before we look at those things is making sure that you only do the things to make it engaging that fit with your audience, topic, and the purpose of your webinar. If you've got a very serious webinar on your hands, you don't really want to be throwing out strange videos or animations that don't match with what you're up to. So really take that in consideration when you do this. I know sometimes it becomes, you almost feel the need to make it more engaging and add things in. But if it's not right, it's not right. Don't feel forced to ever do that. I mean, so for example, let's start from the topic. You want to add more visual elements if it fits in graphs to support your topic. I always try to put things in the core and so that just kind of support what's going on so that it visually looks more pleasing, maybe just to me. But, and if I'm doing something on a specific thing, I will use graphs as that concise, that so people could see. So there's different kinds of media throughout the webinar so people can be really engaging what's going on and it's not just the same the whole way through. Using useful and relevant videos, I think is also a really great thing. And I've seen it to great effect where people have sort of broken up their webinar with just short videos where it was kind of essentially, I watched a webinar, I think it was only 2 months back, where someone came in with a discussion point, had a video which was almost a counterpoint and then responded to that. And another video which was to talk about how people felt about that subject matter. And then they spoke again in person live about how they felt about that. And it was really good because it kind of built the illusion of a discussion happening then and there. And I found it to be really engaging and it really broke things up a little bit. However, I have also seen people who use videos for predominantly most of their presentation, which I almost felt a little bit cheated by because I felt like I was basically joined a webinar to watch a video. So use them wisely rather than constantly and when they fit. Now, there's lots of other functions that a lot of these webinar posts platforms, sorry, have, like polls and chat functions. And I think they're really great to use as well. Polls, I think, are one of those great things to use if you think you can get something out of your audience. If there's something you want to learn about them, or if there's something interesting you want to throw at them to discuss and put down, I think they're fantastic. But really that's when they're at their best. I've seen webinars not even too long ago where someone was putting polls in for the sake of engagement, and they just didn't really match with what was going on, and they wasn't really telling anyone anything. And to me, that's kind of distracting from what you want to achieve. And people will be answering a question when they should actually be listening to you on something that doesn't really matter to the grand scheme of things. So once again, use it if it works and if you're going to gain something from it. They are great when you have that. And also chat functions are great if you just want to have a quick conversation during the webinar, or if you have some questions you want to ask. But that moves me into my next point, which is essentially have a Q&A. More times than not, when you run a webinar, there's going to be something you miss by accident, or there's going to be something that's not quite clear. And the best way to deal with that is by having a Q&A, making sure that people can talk to you and ask you questions about things. Because I know in a webinar like this, lots of this stuff will apply differently to different organizations, and it gives them a chance to ask, how would I do it for mine, and such like that. And I found that that's really useful time. So really add that into your Q&A, and you can add that however you want. It could be midway through after a heavy subject matter. It could be right at the end, like we like to do, so that we can sort of wrap it up with that. But whatever way you want to use it, it's a great feature to really communicate with your audience and engage with them. Now, marketing can make magic. And obviously this is a very important part about holding a webinar, because at the end of the day, if you get 1 million signups to your webinar, but nobody comes, then it's kind of all for nothing, isn't it? So that's why when you look at the marketing for a webinar, it has to be split into what I would believe 2 separate plans. And that is essentially an acquisition plan and a retention plan. Now, an acquisition plan you would go about any way normally you would. I've kind of put the examples that we use here, essentially with the, we use emails, socials, newsletter, paid ads, and so on. But different organizations and the different types of webinars you're going to hold will be run very differently. It could be that you communicate directly with your users and ask them to turn to things or sign up for things. Like I said, really depends on your own marketing tactics that you use, but that's the first step. And then the second step is creating a retention plan, because you could get, like I said, you can get so many signups, but no one turns up on the actual day. So you have to have a marketing plan in place to make sure that you're in contact with those people and making sure that you've told them to come to this webinar that's coming up. They've already signed up, so they are in some way going to be interested in it. But what you really need to do is make sure that you're staying on top of them, letting them know the kinds of things that they're going to find out, a little bit more information, checking up, letting them know it's in a week's time. It could be you let them know the day before, just so you stay in contact, so that when it comes to it, they turn up and you don't have any problems at your hands when you put a lot of effort into everything else and then no one actually turns up. So really think of it as like that. Like I said, the tactics you use are really up to you and what you see success with. It could be a lot of trial and error. Like I said, I've only put what we would do, because yeah, webinars different between every organization. But like I said, really think of it in those 2 different ways, or else you're not going to get turned up. Okay, so there's the last few kind of points I wanted to make, which I might have missed in the actual presentation, which I think are really important and that we really need to think about when you put together a webinar. So the first thing is ask for feedback after. This is something we do with every one of our webinars, because it's all right going back from a webinar and saying to yourself, well, we thought this went well and we thought this didn't go so well. But if you don't ask your audience or users directly, then you'll never really know what worked for them. And you need to marry your own conclusions with those so that you can get better for the future. I know that we basically have a survey at the end of ours so that we can get a feel for how people felt about different subject matters, and so that we can take that and move forward and make our webinars better. We run them every 2 weeks, so we really need that. But yeah, on top of that, make sure you have all the resources you use in your webinar available afterwards. So what I mean by that is, for example, I mentioned earlier that we have a written version of this webinar, essentially, that will be included in the resources at the end after the webinar. So we also upload this webinar directly onto YouTube about a week later. We also will include download to slides, things like that, so that everyone has everything they need afterwards. So you're not sort of communicating with people, and then after it's all said and done, you're kind of leaving them in the dark to go do whatever they need. You give them everything they need from your webinar to go and do whatever you want them to do, which is obviously very important, especially in this sector. Make sure you're in the right environment to present. And I mean, I kind of joked about this now, given that I'm kind of washed out at the moment from my computer screen, but it's amazing how many webinars I've been in where a cat or dog joins in. And to be fair, I find it quite adorable and very interesting. but it's not ideal if you're doing particular types of webinars and it breaks things up. But also on top of that, you need to make sure that you've got your where you are has good enough internet to do everything you need to do. You need to make sure maybe children don't interrupt you, because if it ruins your flow, it can really throw off the entire webinar. So, and on top of that, don't, unless you have to, I wouldn't recommend presenting in a coffee shop or something like that, because that's just not ideal. But also, yeah, think about background noise and stuff like that you might occur during the webinar, because that will play a huge part in the success and the engagement of your webinar. Also, as I mentioned before about using the tech to do this, but you want to make sure that your webinar is accessible as possible. Having those things in place, like I said, the live captions and subtitles when it comes out, just make sure that you're not restricting your webinar to groups of people. So making sure whatever you want to do, really think about how accessible it is and make sure you put the precautions in place to make sure that those people are still allowed to join and will be able to take part. And this is something really important. And I mean, it goes without saying a little bit that sometimes if you've never run a webinar, it doesn't always go perfectly the first time. I know the first time I ever hosted one and presented one, it wasn't ideal, and I had to learn a lot along the way, and there's a lot of trial and error involved. But taking that on board will make your webinars better in the future, and don't get discouraged if it doesn't work out the first time around, because at the end of the day, with the work, looking at the feedback, looking at your own conclusions and getting better each time will make your webinars better and better, and they'll become such a strong resource that you'll be able to use for your users and your audience. So really don't get discouraged. Have a real good crack at it and then see if it works in the future. Right. I don't know how long it's been. I don't think it was too long, but yeah, I'd love to answer some questions and invite Alice back to help me with this. One point I should also mention, if you have any back end of house sort of questions about sort of using recording and such, Zoe is on hand to answer particular questions like that. So yeah, just because I'm a presenter and a host mostly, I've not done that side of things. So luckily we've got our back end to help with those kind of questions. But yeah, Alice, could you come out the shadows, please?
I will. It's interesting to hear you talk about the different platforms, because I am clearly not used to Zoom. If anyone was in the webinar nice and promptly right at the beginning, I didn't realize that you were all here. So I was there checking I looked okay. Looking at my script, and Nick messaged me saying people are in the webinar. So I'm used to Zoom, I'm used to Teams, and you kind of let guests in from the lobby. So yes, it was interesting hearing your comparisons, Nick. I also find with this kind of format is you can't feed off the audience's energy, but it's so true what you say, isn't it? It's about what is right for what you're delivering in terms of what you use. But I thought that was very engaging, and I thought that was very interesting. So let's take a little look at some of the questions, shall we? I know that some have been posted on the main chat, so just a little reminder, if you have done that, pop it in the Q&A bit and then we can take a look. So we have had, please can you clarify what the 5x5 rule is? I didn't quite understand.
Yeah, sorry, I probably skimmed over that a little quickly. So the 5x5 rule is essentially where per slide, you try to keep it with words to about 5 bullet points per slide, so that you don't overwhelm you with too much writing. And yeah, so it's just essentially just 5 bullet points per slide to get the point across that you want to. And sometimes if you need to do more, split it across slides, but try not to put too much onto one. And the 5x5 rule, though not set in stone, like I said, I did one with 6, but you know, it's a good starting place when creating your slides.
Yeah, you don't want to overload, do you? People
No.
reading as well. Excellent. Hopefully that helped. What is the right length for a webinar? How long is too long?
I'm going to give that golden answer that it depends, but we can go from a starting point, really. I think the sweet spot for any webinars between half an hour to an hour, but going up to 2 hours, depending on what you're talking about, is perfectly natural as well. But you might want to place some breaks in that. But like I said, I think half an hour to 45 minutes is the real, because there's going to be some people in the crowd like myself who've got a very short attention span, and any more than that, I'm going to lose interest. So, but yeah, like I said, if you got something really quite in depth you needed to talk about, and there's some things you need to do in your webinar, look to do longer. But a great starting point is that sort of 45-minute mark. Yeah,
I attended a 4-hour one once, and it was too long.
No, not about that life.
Too long. Yeah. Okay, next question. Any tips for presenting to a global audience, different time zone and different languages? That's a great question.
That is a brilliant question. So I've been in a few webinars where this has happened. I was watching rather than being part of them, but what they did was try to find the sweet spot of a time that wasn't too intrusive for most of the people that their audience was. I think it meant that I had to watch it at 7 a.m., which is in the grand scheme of things not that terrible. But I think across the world, it was essentially most people are either right in the evening or right in the morning, and they with who they had coming to that webinar. It's just really mapping out who you think is going to come, where they're going to be, what time zones they're in, and then finding an area where you're not forcing someone to be in the middle of the night. Obviously, if you can somehow keep in the working hours, that's great, but it might be very tricky. Now, with the different languages, I think it's finding the platform that works in telling you exactly what live captions it can give you. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not 100% sure which platform could do that, but I'm sure there will be some. I've seen if it might be worth in sometimes of those is to get them captioned in different languages after they've been recorded. I know you can do that quite easily, but I know there'll definitely be a platform that can give you more than one language in captions as well.
That is a beautiful segue. It's almost like you're looking at the Q&A to our next question, which I think Zoe is actually going to answer, which is the explaining a bit more about the captions and ways to make it accessible.
Yeah, so I mean, I can touch on in the sense of that live captions is a feature that we have on Zoom where they can verbally put down what I'm going to be saying as best as possible, I believe. I don't know the back end of it that much, but it makes it more accessible for people who won't be able to hear the webinar, so that they'll be able to read what's going on as it happens. It's also the same what we do with captions. So every time we finish a webinar, we put them in for captions so that they're all subtitled when we upload them onto YouTube. If Zoe has anything more to add, that she will type that question for you as well.
Excellent. So the next one, so we often bring in external speakers for our webinars. What tips do you have for helping things to run smoothly?
Brilliant question. So what we have always done is essentially we have essentially a debrief period where a week before the webinar happens, we meet with everyone who's a guest and we essentially either walk through the entire webinar with them, or we just explain how it's going to work, get an idea of what they're expecting and making sure that they are as comfortable as possible and they have everything they need so that they are comfortable, and making sure that communication is there between us and them so that they always have what they need, and also they know what's expected of them so that we can run it as smoothly as possible. If you're really worried about it, I think a really great thing to do would be do a test run of the webinar so that everyone knows what's coming. So there's no worries about bringing speakers on, turning cameras off and such like that. A practice one would be the most ideal thing to do with that.
Excellent. What is the best way to invite people to a webinar that enables reminders? So do you use your standard email provider or something like Eventbrite? It's another really good questions here.
Really good question with the answer of it depends again. But yeah, so if we discuss how we do it, essentially is that when someone signs up to one of our webinars, we have them put immediately onto a special list of contacts who then are provided with emails at a certain set date to make sure that they come. And those ones are sort of updated so we know what to tell them at certain times. But if you have a good CRM system that allows you to do that automatically, that's fantastic. I think Eventbrite does that kind of thing when you do a very ticketed system. However, what I would say against the automatic systems is that sometimes, especially what we try to do, is that when we do those reminders, we also do try to put some extra information about the webinar. And if that's a completely automated process, you might lose out on that. But if you just want a standard reminder, there's lots of different platforms that you can do your sort of sign up process with that will do that automatically for you. You just have to set up the times and what needs to be said.
Excellent. Are there any interactive tools that you would recommend to encourage better engagement with your audience?
Yeah, so I mean, I touched on that a little bit, but I think it depends on what you want to achieve. But as I said, the best interactive tools I've seen the most use with by far has always been polls. And I just find that the people who've used that correctly have really got it really well down, and they've sort of asked a very relevant question to what they're talking about that people want to know the answer to, and then they've been able to then take the results and then give that information back to the audience and be like, right, okay, well, what you said here is actually not correct because of this and this, or if you're doing this, you should try working on this. And when you set up a period where you've really thought about your poll, and then you almost have a segment afterwards to discuss the results with your audience, are some of the best webinars I've ever seen. Now, there's loads of other things you could do, like I mentioned, and some of the platforms have other things you could do, like I'm trying to think of what a good example of it. I've seen, what was that one we used, Remo, where it was like a chat room and you could sit at tables and discuss with each other different types of subject matters. That was really cool too. But like I said, the best thing I think you can start with is really thinking out a really good poll system, because I just think that of all the interactive things I've seen, that was the best one that I saw practically done in a way that was really engaging with the audience when thought out. Also, as I mentioned in my example, that I've seen people use it pretty poorly. So really think about that. And I think it's a really great engagement tool.
Excellent. I like this one. How do you deal with nerves in the lead up and delivery, if you have any? Any tips for nerves?
Yes, I guess I do. And that's essentially, I don't know. I used to get very nervous before a lot of these webinars, especially when I was early on. But the key thing I think that makes me feel better is when I really know what I'm talking about and I've practiced it enough, because then I'm kind of only nervous about forgetting something. But when I really know the subject matter, if I do miss something, I can come back to it later. So I always find just really knowing what you're talking about and really feeling comfortable with your webinar is the best thing you can do for nerves. I know that's not going to help everybody, but I think it's just, yeah, I guess just be prepared and that will really help. But I guess in other ways, I think that one thing that helps with webinars is that at the end of the day that you can't see anyone. So imagining the fact that you're just sort of here by myself is quite an easy way to get past some of those nerves if it's on this platform. But yeah, like I said, just preparation is the best thing. And once you do more webinars, it gets easier and easier and easier.
Yeah, I will remember the next time that people can see me checking.
Exactly.
But yeah, it's a nerve-wracking thing, but I think, you know, you can just remember that everyone's human, and I like to make a joke to break the ice. I just use humor as a bit of a coping mechanism, maybe. But I'm sure you will be brilliant if you are presenting a webinar soon. Has anyone used the Zoom whiteboard in a small webinar or meeting?
I have not done that, so I'm going to put that to, if you have and you have an answer to that, please use the chat and discuss, because I have never used whiteboard personally. Someone here might have, but I don't know about it enough to comment on it. I'm sorry. No,
neither. Yeah, pop your answers in the chat if you have used that functionality. Sorry, we couldn't help more with that, Alison. When you say don't include too many words on a slide, how would you manage this with sending out the slides after or to people that couldn't make it? Well, that's a very good question. So would you make an extended version of the slides to send out if recording it isn't an option? Is there a less time sensitive way?
So there's a few ways you can go about this. If you can't record it, I would almost, there's a few ways to go. Me personally, what I would do is because I do it on PowerPoint, I would put all the notes of the things I'm going to say underneath each slide. So it literally almost be like a script of the things I know I need to say, or it could just be more in-depth explanations on each bullet point, so that if someone would be just sent the slides, they'd see the bullet points, and then they could see the further details underneath it to get more information. Now, another way you can do it, if you can't record it or send it out, is essentially create a pre-script of all the things about each one, a bit like I was doing in the notes, but send it in a Word document. You could record it privately and then get a transcript made for it, or get it captioned so you could send it off to people. But yeah, you could also, like you've said, make an extended version of the slides and just put more information in as more of a media pack. But once you're doing that, you're kind of almost moving into the territory of it not being a webinar. So it's kind of up to you of what you want to do there. Yeah, you've got a few options. I think like I said, what I would do is just give the extended information in the notes under each slide, so that if someone were to read it rather than watch it, they could get all the information they needed.
Yeah, some really good questions. How long is the best lead time for a webinar? So how far in advance do you recommend promoting it in, for example?
You know what I'm going to say? it depends. But I think with this one, it massively depends on how many people you would like to your webinar, for one. Because if you're just expecting a small audience, you could probably do a few weeks. I know that we kind of run in a more of a 4-week cycle with our webinars. That gives us enough time to sort of promote each one individually and give them enough promotional time. And that kind of gives also things like ads have enough time to learn and then go at their best. And it gives us enough time to fit in emails, retention emails, socials, and everything that we need for it. If you've got a set event, which is held as a webinar and there's a big thing and you've got a lot of people coming on, I'd really start thinking of that as a couple of month project, because you're probably sending something a bit more. But if it's just a short webinar, really, I think a good place to start is the sort of 4-week mark. And then see if you don't get enough done in that time, extend it. If you do, shorten it down. You don't want to bombard your audience too much.
No, make the build up really good, really long. And then you've really got to work on presenting an engaging one.
You do.
Do you think a transcript or a sum up write up is a better post webinar resource?
That is a good question. It depends who you. I would prefer a sum up. If I watched a webinar, I would much prefer a sum up than a transcript. I'm just not going to read that, but at the end of the day, someone else is going to much prefer a transcript. So I think the best thing to do would probably meet in the middle in maybe a detailed sum up that doesn't say quite as much as a transcript does, but it's not just a short summary of what happened. But like I said, judge your audience really and think what you think was going to be the most useful to them. If I'm your audience, please make me a sum up.
It's how people like to digest things, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
I would far rather read slides than a chunk of text or a transcript, but it's exactly like Nick said. I think you've just got to gauge your audience, and polls are good for things like that. Like, how do people like to digest information? What do you do when people don't turn their webcam on? I do training with lots of interactive features, and sometimes no one will come on camera despite my best efforts.
Yes. So I think it's one of those things that as much as you want it, you can never, depending on what the session is. The first thing I would suggest is to pre the session, make it very clear in your marketing or your communications of your users that you would really like them to be on camera so that they can do things with you. But if you don't give them that information first, it's kind of alarming when you ask someone to turn on the camera when they weren't expecting to. You got to remember that people might be sat there in their pajamas. They might be just not in the right state of mind to turn on the camera. They might feel really nervous about it. So I wouldn't say going into a webinar blind and then demanding that someone turns on the webcam can be quite intimidating. So like I said, really build that into your communications beforehand, that is something that you would like to do before you do it, so that when it happens, if they don't do it, they knew that it was going to happen. So it's kind of more on them anyway, and they'll miss out on that, and that'll be more their fault than anything. But yeah, just make, like I said, make the communications clear that you'd like that. If you don't be too disheartened if people don't, because at the end of the day, people just sometimes just do want to sit in the background of a webinar, and that's fine.
What background screen is best? Yours is blurred, but could you go for something different, e.g. a scene? I work for an environmental charity. That's a very good question. I actually, sorry, I appreciate you're the one answering, Nick, but my previous company had a slide that was their branding, and I thought that was really nice. So you never had to blur your background because we always just had this slide with the branding. But yeah, I really like the idea of, especially if it's an environmental charity, like a themed thing.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I think that's a great way of looking at it, because I have done webinars when I first started where I had a pretty distracting background. I thought it was cool. I liked it. But then I remember people telling me directly, they were like, your background is a bit much. And I was like, okay, so that's why I've kind of moved to a blurred background more now. Yeah, but you do have to think about what they could potentially be hiding in your background, like my jacket there. But yeah, I like what Alice said too, that I have done in the past where I have had a very specific background for what I was doing. I know I've done sort of things around Halloween where we all had Halloween backgrounds, Christmas where we had Christmas backgrounds. And if you can do something a bit themed, or that works well with what you're doing, or if it's just like a slide from your presentation as a background, I think that's really great as well. Just make sure that your camera is good enough at differentiating what's what, because you don't want to sort of be diving in and out of your background as well.
Yeah, absolutely. My cat usually likes to come and make an appearance, and half
Yes.
of him will be blurred and half of him will be on camera. So I've had to relocate today so that you don't all meet him.
Mm.
Okay, let's get through because we've got 15 minutes left. So let's get through these last questions. Had issues using embedded video in PowerPoint on a Google Meet webinar. The slides went well, but I couldn't make the video work. They couldn't see it remotely. Any clues on why this would be?
Yeah, I think I know why this would be. Now, what I think probably has happened here is that if it's embedded correctly and it worked before the webinar, it could be that you're sharing a particular screen when you were presenting, so that when you clicked and opened it, they were still seeing the webinar. That's what I would immediately go to. So sometimes the best thing to do is share your complete screen and just make sure you've only got what you need in front of you there, so that you can skip between the video and such very quickly, and they'll see that. Now, some of the resources I think will be better at literally playing the video in the presentation itself, but I'm trying to think, I can't remember which one I did that with once. But like I said, sharing your whole screen rather than just a section of your computer will stop you from having those awkward moments when you go on to something else if you want to leave the presentation. So yeah, that's another way around it, and that might be what happened there.
Hopefully that helps you. How do you manage Q&A sections when people have too many questions for the time frame, or one question goes on for a long time? I struggle to balance encouraging engagement with cutting people off. Yeah, it's a really, really good question.
Really good question. Yeah. So I think with Q&As, the system we work first of all is that we try to do the whole what gets most upvotes questions first, because then it's the general consensus that lots of people want to read those questions. Now, I think the best thing you could do if you get really loads of questions is to take the time to answer them offline and then send them to everybody who turned up, so that they have like almost a pack of all the questions answered that you didn't get a time in the webinar to answer. That way you can answer as many questions as possible and keep everybody as happy as possible. Now, one thing I also would say with some of the questions being very long, if you get asked a really detailed, in-depth question, I would almost then and there just sort of be brave enough to say, I'm going to answer that offline because it would take a long time for me to get through it. I hope you don't mind. I will take that offline. Unless it's something that you think is really valuable to everybody there and you think you need to answer then, really kind of just digest what you think is the best way to go through those questions so that everybody's happy.
Yeah, definitely. I think that shows willing as well, like you're going above and beyond and still wanting to help support. Yeah. Definitely. On that topic, let's get through the last three. So, are webinar packages worth the investment?
Once again, it depends on what you're doing. I think if you're doing a simple webinar like this, not to call my webinar simple, but not really. Like, I think you can do whatever you need to do. And also I'm kind of digesting what kind of packages you're talking about here, but on an overview of like really going in depth and buying from like a provider to make a really in-depth webinar, it depends what you're doing. If your webinar is teetering on an event and you're like ticketing it and such like that, maybe really look at those packages and see if they're worth your time and money. But if it's sort of a bit more enclosed like this, or you're just helping someone over a short period of time, I don't think so, really. Like I said, if you're holding an event, which is more or less a webinar, yes. If not, maybe not.
And what do you see as the benefits of using a webinar form rather than just a Zoom meeting for an information event with speakers?
I think the key difference really there when I would think about that is that, because I've been in both, and I, on a personal level, I found it really, really weird when it was like speakers in a Zoom meeting and everyone was kind of there staring, and it felt completely wrong. And I think you could get around that, and I think you could be okay. And I have been in ones that are more successful than that. But when it's more the participants and such like that, I think it does work out better than that. And it just feels more natural because it is essentially the audience and the presenters, and it makes, and especially if you're someone with nerves, that is definitely better than coming into a big meeting of 100 people and just being like, hi everybody, I'm going to do this in front of you now. So yeah, I would recommend it if you can. If you can't, then maybe you just put the letters forward of everyone to turn their cameras off and such. But then you also run the risk of that someone could just intrude on your webinar and just jump in and start asking questions in the middle of it and interrupting. And though you can manually mute them and such, as you are opening yourself up to that a little bit too.
Oh, this is a really good question from Alison, who I think you were talking about the whiteboard earlier, and there's been some conversation in the chat about that. So definitely everyone have a look at that. So Alison has asked, do you think in the future hybrid events will work? So with people attending in person and other attending online? Yeah, that's
It's a great question. It's a difficult question. I personally think it will, but it has to be done right. So, and I've seen hybrid events before COVID and everything that did work, where it was essentially a live stream of an in-person event where people were talking about certain things and webinars and such. So I know that they can work. I know that over the course of lockdown, there were those sort of like, it's not quite the same thing, but there was those live stream of gigs where some people were at it and other people weren't, and they were great as well. I just think you have to think about it from a hybrid point of view. And we've got loads of articles about how to run hybrid events in Charity Digital. So there's loads of resources there, but I think, yeah, once again, it just comes down to, if you do it right, you can really do a good job, and you allow people to join an event from home when others can turn up in person. It's just if you have the resources, the cameras and everything to really set that all up so it works properly.
Yeah, and it's also like how the people that aren't in person ask the questions for the speakers and things like that. There's a lot of things to get right there, but I definitely think the pandemic has forced things like that to improve. I certainly hope that we will see. I've just relocated from London to the coast, to Folkestone, so there'll be many things that that I would rather not travel for. So I do think, I hope there'll be improvements on things like that. So really good question. And then last, I think, do you have any tips for retention of signups other than touching base with reminder emails? So they see quite a high dropout rate and they would love to combat it.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the things I've analyzed a lot of our retention emails in the past about how they could be better. And one of the key things we did to improve them was that we started looking at retention emails and stopped thinking of them as just being a reminder, and started seeing them as like a feeder of more information as well, that you can start giving, because at the end of the day, when you first start and put your webinar out for marketing, you might not have the full details of what's going to be said, who's going to be speaking. And this is information that people are interested in. You might be able to get put forward and say, hey, look, this is in a week's time. This is the more information that we have about it now. It could be meet the speakers. It could be a video introduction to one of them, and they're going to talk about what they do. I know that we've done this in the past. We've had short videos be sent out by some of our speakers to sort of introduce the subject matter to people prior to the webinar. And we've seen some good success with a few of those. I think it's just, change the mindset from a reminder email to a reminder and a sort of intrigue email into reminding them that they should come, but also why they should come, because you need to give them just a bit of a reminder on that. Also, don't get too disheartened if you have a drop-off rate, because unfortunately, at the end of the day, people will sign up for things, especially free webinars, and they just won't be able to attend later down the line, and that's just unfortunate with it. But as long as you try to keep it as high as possible for what you started with, and you really remind people why they want to come, not just when it's on, then I think you'll have a better dropout rate.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than like putting a lot of work in for something and thinking that you are going to have a really good retention, and unfortunately it's just not happening. So last call for any further questions for Nick or for Zoe, who is like doing our production, so like more of our back end. Oh, good. So we've had a really helpful, and like I said, there's been a conversation in the chat about the whiteboard conversation and using Miro. Some people saying.
Oh, one thing I should add as well that I've been told to, I forgot, I didn't see it, but also that when we caption our videos after they've been recorded, we use rev.com, which we find to be a very useful platform for subtitling things, and it's really accurate. So yeah, just in case anyone wanted that.
Well, we've had lots of compliments, Nick, so you must have been very engaging. Like I said, it would have been terrible if you all switched off.
Just everyone joined and then immediately left. Yeah,
absolutely.
And all the people that I was slamming for their boring webinars, I became. But yes, thank you very much, everybody. I hope you were able to find something from this that you can find useful in the future for your own webinars.
Oh, can we squeeze in one more question?
Yeah, sure.
I've just seen one come through and we've got a couple of minutes. How many people do you have working on this in the background?
We have usually one person. working on the background, but we might have a few more depending on what webinar is being processed. I would say 90% of the time it'll be one, but if it's a case of they need certain bits of support and there's a second person who needs a help, especially in some of our events, we might have 2 or 3. But like I said, 90% of the time it's just one person making sure everything's recording properly, making sure answers are being questions are being answered properly on the chat and such, and making sure that everyone's guided in the way they need to be. Perfect.
And I don't think there's anything else other than just a lot of thank yous and yes, taking the tips on board. Well, wish you luck for all of your future webinars. I've definitely learned so much. Thank you for being patient with me, because I know that it was my first ever one hosting. Nick, have you got anything to add?
No, perfect. Just good luck with all your webinars. And thank you so much for being here. And like I said, all resources will be made available at the end of the year when we repost everything up.
Excellent. Have a lovely day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.